Air travel is a major source of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, and China doesn't show any signs to cut theirs. The country is already the world leader in CO2 production, with just under 10 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. That's almost a third of all global man-made CO2 each year. While world leaders were debating climate change in New York, China unveiled the second biggest airport in the world, soon to handle more than 70 million passengers per year. Chinese President Xi Jinping cut the ribbon for the $60 billion project, completed in just 4 years' time, to be one of the largest airports in the world. Daxing is ready to serve 45 million passengers per year initially, and is set to expand to a capacity of over 70 million. It has 4 runways and 268 gates. A new high-speed train connection allows for a fast trip from there to the Chinese capital. But it clearly shows that for China, economic expansion seems to come before climate protection. How much sense does it make if we all reduce ours? Well, let's bring in Alexander Reitzenstein. He's with the E3G, an independent climate change think tank here in Berlin. Alexander, Germany produces just 2% of global CO2, just introduced stricter climate regulation. China opens a new mega airport. How much sense does all this well-intentioned climate action of countries like Germany make if world-leading CO2 emitters like China obviously don't care?
It's a good question. I guess there are two sides of this story. China has a massive economic growth. Beijing, we're talking about a city with more than 20 billion inhabitants, 1.4 billion inhabitants in China. Rising middle class, of course, there's a high demand. We have a growth rate in aviation of 6% per year. So it's, in a way, a rational project for China. On the other hand, what we can see in China is a lot of climate action. It's the largest manufacturer of solar PV, for example, and wind and solar are already quite cheap. So I guess the issue with China is while they're moving in some sectors, they're clearly not moving in others, and that's the big challenge. On Germany, I would argue...
Does it offset, though? You know that they're producing lots of solar panels. Does it somehow offset their CO2 emissions? No, it doesn't.
It doesn't. I mean, and they're meeting the targets, but the targets they have for 2020, 2030 are obviously too low for the Paris Climate Agreement. So I guess for the next years, the big challenge is to cooperate with China. There's a big role for the EU to play as a role model, showing how this works, cooperating with China on being more ambitious on both sides. And that's what we're hearing from Chinese officials. We want to see a lot of ambition from the EU, then we will move as well.
Well, being a role model, there's an interesting discussion going on because many people say, yes, we must be, Germany in particular, must be a role model. But others say strict climate regulation will hurt the economy. How much of a role model will we be as Germans if our car industry goes down because we introduce climate legislation?
I actually see the other way around. I think Germany has to move on climate action to remain competitive. I guess the big question for the German car industry, do we still sell cars in 10 or 15 years? And there will probably more be e-cars than the cars we're having right now. So for Germany, I think it's quite rational from a competitiveness point of view to move right now.
But how will German, British or Mexican car owners ever be convinced to scrap their diesels to do their bit while others do nothing?
Well,
the man on the street I'm talking about.
Yeah, definitely the man on the street. I think that the issue we're having right now, it's not that Germany is doing its homework. I mean, we have this climate package, but it's by far not enough. So this perception that Germany is moving while others are moving not is just not true.
OK, well, are others moving... I mean, comparable economies are moving in a comparable way or taking bigger steps? Is France doing more?
France and the UK, I mean, from an emission point of view, I mean, there is this big role of coal, of course, where Germany and China are two of the major emitters. China is number 1, Germany is number 4. So this plays a big role in CO2 emissions, and this is why those countries play a bigger role. And then there's, of course, this big question around shared responsibility. China arguing, well, we have to catch up. We have economic growth. We need to make our people happy, while you're already rich. And that's the big conversation we're having on an international level.
Yeah, well, that's a very valid point. But how much climate protection is economically viable?
So there are recent numbers by the OECD basically showing that the net effect on GDP of ambitious climate action is positive in most G20 countries. I think it's 18 out of 20. So It is rational. The issue is less about the economic case. I would say that some sectors are heavily affected. Of course, the coal sector will disappear, while others will benefit. We have major growth sectors like energy efficiency, renewable energy, e-mobility. So these are the opportunity sectors. I guess the issue is, how do we manage the decline of, for example, coal? How do we manage the transition of the car industry?
Do you think that China, in the very near term, and everybody says it's high time that we reduce CO2 emissions, in the very near term will put climate protection before growth?
What makes me optimistic is that it's not only a moral question for China. There's also a lot of national interest. They do already have very high economic costs because of climate change. There are major issues around air pollution, around desertification, for example. So they have good reasons to move. And next year is actually quite important. There will be a major EU-China summit where both hopefully try to work together to work towards more ambitious climate policies.
Alexander Ratzenstein, thank you very much for this analysis.